Welcome to Brainwaves, your go-to destination for fun and educational content. Today, we're going to take a journey back to a time when dragons, unicorns, and other mythical creatures roamed the earth. Or so they thought. That's right. We are talking about the Middle Ages, a period from the 5th to the 15th century. It was a time of castles, knights, and monarchs, but also a time of bizarre beliefs and superstitions that may have you scratching your head. In this video, we're going to explore 5 crazy things people in the Middle Ages believed. So, sit tight and get ready to be transported back in time. Dragons were an integral part of medieval life. They were often depicted in art, literature, and heraldry. Dragons were believed to be powerful and fearsome creatures. They were associated with both good and evil. In Christian texts, dragons were seen as a representation of the devil, while in other cultures, they were seen as powerful protectors. There are many legends about various types of dragons. The 2 most famous types were the European dragon and the Chinese dragon. European dragons were thought to be fire-breathing creatures that terrorized villages and could only be defeated by brave knights. Chinese dragons, on the other hand, were seen as benevolent creatures that brought good luck and were used to represent the emperor. One of the most famous images of a dragon is that of Saint George slaying the dragon. It is said that the dragon attacked a town, and Saint George, a great warrior, rode in to slay the beast and save the townspeople. This image became a popular symbol of the power and bravery of knights. Dragons were also used in heraldry as a symbol of power and nobility. Many noble families had dragons on their coats of arms, and the mythical creature was often used to represent royalty and leadership. Overall, dragons were an important part of medieval culture, and their presence can be seen throughout art, literature, and heraldry of the time. Unicorns were another mythical creature commonly believed to exist during the medieval period. They were associated with purity, innocence, and grace, and were often depicted as white horses with a single horn protruding from their foreheads. Many believed that their horns had magical healing powers and were even used in medicine during the time. The obsession with unicorns can be seen in the many depictions of them in art, tapestries, and other forms of decoration. One famous tapestry depicting a unicorn hunt is called the Hunt of the Unicorn. In the tapestry, a group of men is shown hunting a unicorn, highlighting the perceived magical powers of the creature. In addition to their association with magic and healing, unicorns were also used to symbolize purity and chastity. It is said that only a virgin could catch a unicorn, and their horns were believed to have the ability to purify water. While many of these beliefs may seem strange to us today, they were an important part of medieval culture and had a significant impact on the social, political, and religious life of the time. In addition to dragons and unicorns, other mythical creatures were also believed to exist during the Middle Ages. Mermaids, for example, were considered to be half-human, half-fish creatures that lived in the sea. They were often depicted as beautiful and alluring, but also dangerous and seductive. Many sailors believed in the existence of mermaids and thought they were a bad omen for their voyages. Griffins were another mythical creature believed to exist in the Middle Ages. Griffins were depicted as having the body of a lion and the head of an eagle. They were considered guardians of treasure and were thought to fiercely protect it. In heraldry, the griffin was used to represent strength and courage. Centaurs were half-human, half-horse creatures that were believed to inhabit forests and mountains. They were often depicted as wild and unruly, and sometimes as violent. However, there were also stories of centaurs who were wise teachers and healers. They were used as a symbol of man's connection to nature and the wilderness. Overall, these mythical creatures were an important part of medieval culture and were used to symbolize different aspects of life. They were often depicted in art, literature, and heraldry and had significant cultural significance. The flat Earth theory was a widely held belief during the Middle Ages that the Earth was flat and not spherical. This was largely based on observations from the naked eye that suggested the Earth appeared flat. The idea of a spherical Earth was first proposed by Greek philosopher Pythagoras in the 6th century BCE and was later proven by astronomer Eratosthenes in the 3rd century BCE. However, many people during the Middle Ages rejected this idea and instead believed that the Earth was flat. They argued that if the Earth was round, people on the bottom would fall off. Later, the Church supported the idea of a flat Earth, as it was seen as more in line with the Bible. It wasn't until the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries that the spherical Earth theory began to gain more widespread acceptance. The geocentric model was another widely held belief during the Middle Ages that the Sun, Moon and planets all revolved around the Earth. This model was developed by the Greek philosopher Aristotle and was later refined by the astronomer Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE. The model was based on observations from the naked eye that suggested the Earth was at the center of the universe. However, the model had many problems and inconsistencies, such as the retrograde motion of planets. This meant that at times planets would appear to move backwards in the sky, and this was difficult to explain in the geocentric model. Later, the Polish astronomer Copernicus proposed a new model in the 16th century, called the heliocentric model. This model placed the Sun at the center of the universe with planets, including Earth, revolving around it. This was a major breakthrough in astronomy and paved the way for discoveries by astronomers like Galileo and Newton. Religion had a significant influence on scientific beliefs during the Middle Ages. The Church played an important role in society and had a considerable impact on what people believed. The Church believed that the Bible was the Word of God and that all scientific knowledge should be interpreted in such a way as to support the Bible. As a result, Church doctrine often contradicted scientific evidence that challenged traditional biblical teachings. For example, the Church rejected the idea of a spherical Earth and a heliocentric universe, as they contradicted Scripture. This led to many people, including scientists, rejecting these ideas as well. Additionally, the Church heavily censored scientific texts and ideas that they deemed to be heretical or against Church doctrine. This stifled scientific innovation and progress during the Middle Ages, as new and challenging ideas were not allowed to flourish. It wasn't until later that the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment allowed for greater freedom of thought and inquiry, leading to significant advances in science and the rejection of many previously held ideas. The concept of miasma was an ancient belief that existed for centuries and played a role in shaping people's understanding of disease. Miasma was seen as a foul and poisonous air that was thought to spread diseases like the plague, typhus, and cholera. According to this theory, miasma was caused by decaying organic matter, such as rotting food or dead animals. It was also believed that miasma could arise due to environmental factors like stagnant water, sewage, and garbage. People in ancient Greece and Rome believed in the idea of miasma, which then gradually spread throughout Europe during the Middle Ages. The miasma theory had an impact on hygiene practices because being exposed to bad smells was believed to be the way diseases spread. Therefore, people would try to get rid of bad smells by burning incense or carrying around flowers, while some would just cover up the smells with sweet perfumes. Despite its flaws, the miasma theory remained popular among many people and physicians until the mid-19th century. It was only then that a new theory called the germ theory of disease was developed and supported by scientists, which showed the limitations of the miasma theory. The miasma theory claimed that diseases were caused by bad smells or poisonous vapors, and therefore, people believed that avoiding exposure to such odors would prevent them from falling ill. However, many people who lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions continued to contract diseases despite these efforts to avoid bad smells. There were many diseases that were associated with miasma, including the bubonic plague, cholera, and tuberculosis. For example, during the outbreaks of the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages, people believed that miasma was the cause, and they would try to protect themselves from it by carrying around posies or lighting fires. Nevertheless, the bubonic plague continued to ravage Europe for centuries. Similarly, during the cholera outbreak in London in the mid-19th century, people believed that miasma was causing the disease, and so they would burn aromatic material to purify the air. But cholera continued to spread, and many people died. The link between miasma and disease was disproven in the mid-19th century by scientific advances like the germ theory of disease that showed the actual cause of many diseases to be bacterial or viral infections, rather than bad smells or miasma. The understanding of disease transmission has come a long way since the days of the miasma theory, and we now have a much better understanding of how diseases spread and how to prevent them. The miasma theory persisted for centuries despite its inaccuracies, but it began to lose ground in the mid-19th century with the development of the germ theory of disease. This new theory proved that disease was caused by microorganisms like bacteria and viruses, not bad smells or miasma as previously believed. The germ theory of disease was developed by many scientists, including Louis Pasteur, who was instrumental in proving that microorganisms caused diseases like anthrax and rabies. The work of many scientists, including Pasteur, brought attention to the fact that cleaning up the environment did not effectively prevent diseases. Instead, the eradication of the microorganisms that caused infections was crucial in preventing diseases. This meant that a focus on personal hygiene, like washing hands regularly and maintaining cleanliness, was important in combating the spread of disease. The end of the miasma theory had a significant impact on the field of medicine, paving the way for a greater understanding of infectious diseases and the discovery of antibiotics. It also led to changes in public health policies, such as improvements in sanitation, cleaner water supplies, and reduced overcrowding. These changes helped reduce the spread of infectious diseases and improved overall health outcomes for many populations. The miasma theory may seem like an ancient belief now, but the legacy of the theory persists in our language and culture. For example, we still use phrases like miasma of disease to describe the atmosphere of a place that is contaminated or carries the aura of danger. While modern medicine has advanced far beyond the miasma theory, it remains an important part of medical history and our evolution of understanding diseases as humans. The idea of spontaneous generation, the belief that living things could be created out of non-living matter such as mud, was not invented during the Middle Ages, it was much older. The famous philosopher Aristotle accepted the notion, and this helped to cement the idea in the general public's mind. Spontaneous generation took root in part because of the limitations of scientific understanding at the time. The phenomenon of reproduction was not well understood, and so the appearance of something new from what was once inert matter was seen as perfectly plausible. Over the centuries, this belief was further perpetuated by various influential figures, such as Jean-Baptiste van Helmont, the Flemish physician, scientist, and philosopher. Van Helmont conducted an experiment in the 17th century to explain how mice were spontaneously generated. He sealed a sweaty shirt, wheat grains, and cheese in an open jar and waited. After a few weeks, he found that the jar was filled with tiny mice. His conclusion was that life could be magically created without the agency of parents or higher powers. This theory may seem ludicrous today, but it provides a fascinating glimpse into the scientific understanding, or lack thereof, of the past. Aristotle was one of the most influential philosophers and scientists of the ancient world, but he is also responsible for helping to spread the idea of spontaneous generation. Aristotle believed in a hierarchy of living things, with humans at the top and inanimate objects at the bottom, and he described spontaneous generation as occurring in the lower levels of this hierarchy. Aristotle thought that worms spontaneously generated from mud and that mice spontaneously generated from grains of wheat, for example. Although these beliefs were eventually disproven, they were held in high esteem for centuries and had a significant impact on scientific thought. Aristotle's opinions were widely accepted in his time, in part because he was such a revered figure, but also because this belief persisted for so many centuries without being seriously challenged. Jean-Baptiste van Helmont, a physician, scientist, and philosopher from Flanders, conducted an experiment in the 17th century that provided support for spontaneous generation. Van Helmont claimed that by placing a dirty shirt in a barrel filled with grains of wheat and leaving it for several days, he could create mice through the process of spontaneous generation. According to Van Helmont, the mice grew larger as they consumed the wheat in the barrel. Van Helmont believed that the soil particles contained a vegetative force that was capable of creating life. He also believed that this force could transform any non-living matter into living organisms. Van Helmont's experiment was deeply flawed, however, as he did not consider the possibility that the jar contained pre-existing microorganisms that produced the mice. Nevertheless, Van Helmont's conclusions were accepted by many for centuries and represent an example of how scientific theories can be deeply flawed yet still gain widespread acceptance. In the Middle Ages, various forms of evidence were used to support the idea of spontaneous generation. For example, the appearance of maggots on decaying meat or the sudden swarming of flies were seen as evidence of spontaneous generation. People believed that dead flesh could generate new life spontaneously because they failed to understand the complex processes of decomposition and reproduction. Similarly, folk beliefs and superstitions supported the idea of spontaneous generation. For example, it was believed that snakes arose spontaneously from horsehair, that lice could arise from dust, and that inanimate objects could come to life. These beliefs were reinforced by a lack of access to scientific knowledge and the difficulty in conducting experiments during this time period. Also, the idea of the spontaneous generation of microscopic organisms seemed plausible, as they were not visible to the naked eye and their existence was not widely understood until the development of microscopy. One of the main arguments used to support spontaneous generation during the Middle Ages was the physical appearance of maggots and flies. At the time, it was commonly believed that maggots were spontaneously generated on decaying meat and that flies, in turn, arose from maggots. This belief was due to several factors, including the fact that meat would appear to spontaneously produce maggots without any obvious source, and that there was difficulty understanding where these maggots could have come from. A lack of understanding about the process of decomposition and the role of existing eggs or larvae also contributed to this belief. The physical appearance of flies emerging from maggots seemed to provide further evidence for the process of spontaneous generation, and it was not until the 17th century that Francesco Reddy showed that these flies actually come from eggs laid by adult flies. In addition to physical observations, various folk beliefs and superstitions contributed to the acceptance of spontaneous generation during the Middle Ages. For instance, it was believed that mice could be generated spontaneously from dirty clothes or that beetles could be created from cow dung. Such beliefs were often based on limited scientific knowledge and misunderstandings of the natural world, but they served to perpetuate the idea that life could arise spontaneously from non-living matter. Interestingly, some of these beliefs persisted even in the face of evidence to the contrary, such as the discovery of insect eggs and larvae, showing the deeply ingrained nature of these superstitions. The idea of spontaneous generation was eventually disproven through the efforts of several key scientists. One of the earliest experiments to challenge spontaneous generation was conducted by Francesco Reddy in the late 17th century. Reddy showed that maggots arise from eggs laid by adult flies and not from decaying meat as previously believed. Another important researcher in this area was Louis Pasteur, who conducted more sophisticated experiments in the 19th century. His experiments conclusively disproved spontaneous generation and provided definitive evidence for the role of microorganisms in the process of fermentation. The impact of these experiments was significant. They helped to establish the scientific method and paved the way for further discoveries in microbiology and related fields. Today, we take the idea of biogenesis, that life can only come from other living matter, for granted, but it was a major breakthrough that took centuries to achieve. Francesco Reddy was an Italian physician and scientist who conducted an experiment in the late 17th century to challenge the idea of spontaneous generation. In his experiment, Reddy placed meat in different jars and covered each jar with a different material. One was left open, one was covered with gauze, and one was sealed tightly. Reddy's goal was to determine whether maggots were spontaneously generated on meat or whether they came from pre-existing eggs laid by adult flies. As Reddy hypothesized, maggots only appeared in the jar that was left open, while the jars covered with gauze and sealed tightly did not produce any maggots. Reddy's experiment demonstrated that adult flies were the source of the maggots and challenged the belief in spontaneous generation. By showing that the physical presence of flies was necessary for the appearance of maggots and that meat contained pre-existing eggs and larvae, Reddy provided some of the earliest evidence for biogenesis, the idea that life only comes from other living matter. Louis Pasteur, a French microbiologist, conducted a series of experiments in the 19th century that definitively disproved the idea of spontaneous generation. One of Pasteur's most famous experiments involved creating a specially designed swan-necked flask containing a nutrient-rich broth that would allow air to flow in but keep out any potential contaminants. Pasteur boiled the broth to kill any existing microorganisms and then watched as no new life forms grew. When the flask was tilted, the broth touched the curved neck, and any potential contaminants entered the flask. In this way, Pasteur demonstrated that life only comes from other living matter and that microorganisms do not spontaneously generate from non-living matter. This experiment overturned centuries of belief in spontaneous generation and provided definitive evidence for biogenesis. As a result, Pasteur is widely regarded as one of the most significant contributors to the field of microbiology, and his work paved the way for further discoveries in this area. The experiments of Reddy and Pasteur had a profound impact on scientific thought and sparked further inquiry into the origins of life. Reddy's experiment helped to shift the scientific community's perception of spontaneous generation from accepted fact to a mere hypothesis. By showing that maggots only arose in open containers of meat and not in jars covered with gauze or tightly sealed, Reddy demonstrated that life could not arise spontaneously from non-living matter. Pasteur's experiment, on the other hand, provided the most definitive evidence for biogenesis, showing that life only comes from other living matter, and that microorganisms do not spontaneously generate from non-living matter. These experiments helped establish the scientific method as the primary means of investigating the natural world and inspired a new generation of scientists to explore the relationship between living and non-living matter. These breakthroughs are still celebrated and studied today, demonstrating the importance of questioning accepted beliefs and using evidence-based approaches to scientific inquiry. During the Middle Ages, it was widely believed that women were the weaker and less intelligent sex compared to men. This belief was based on the idea that women were physically weaker than men and that their intellectual capacities were limited. Men believed that women were only capable of handling household chores and child-rearing, whereas they reserved intellectual and public roles for themselves. A popular book of medicine during the Middle Ages, authored by a man named Trotula, claimed that men were more intelligent than women because men have more blood in their brains. These beliefs were further reinforced by the Church, which viewed women as inferior due to the biblical story of Eve, who was portrayed as the temptress that led Adam to sin. This belief led to the development of a legal doctrine called coverture that stipulated that a woman's legal rights were subsumed by her husband's after marriage. Women were barred from receiving education or legal representation, and their economic opportunities were largely dependent on their husbands or male relatives. The belief in women being the weaker and less intelligent sex was a deeply entrenched aspect of medieval society and had long-lasting effects on women's social, economic and legal standing. The belief that women were more susceptible to sin and temptation than men was another common belief during the Middle Ages. This belief was rooted in the biblical story of Adam and Eve, where Eve was portrayed as the one who tempted Adam to eat the forbidden fruit. This led to the view that women were inherently weak-willed and morally inferior to men. The Church reinforced this belief by associating women with sin and labeling them as daughters of Eve. The idea was that women had inherited Eve's sin and that they had to be constantly monitored and controlled to prevent them from sinning. Women were expected to be modest in their dress and behavior, and any deviation from these norms was seen as evidence of their sinful nature. This belief was linked to the notion of female sexuality being dangerous and needed to be controlled by men. It was common for women to be punished severely, often with public shaming or even death, for perceived sexual sins like adultery or premarital sex. This belief had long-lasting effects on women's lives, as they were subjected to strict codes of conduct and moral scrutiny, which held them back from achieving social and economic equality with men. Women were often excluded from public life, and their role was relegated to that of a wife and mother. The historical impact of these beliefs on women in society cannot be understated. The idea that women were weaker and less intelligent than men led to their exclusion from education, legal rights, and public life. Women were believed to be only capable of handling household chores and child-rearing, and their intellectual talents were often ignored. This belief hindered the progress of society as it prevented women from contributing their talents and skills to the betterment of society. This belief also led to the development of legal doctrines that treated women as property and denied them basic rights like ownership of property or custody of their own children. The belief that women were more susceptible to sin and temptation than men had even more devastating effects on women's lives. This belief provided the justification for centuries of violence against women in the form of witch hunts and trials. Thousands of women were burned at the stake, accused of being witches or practicing magic. The majority of these women were innocent victims of superstition and hysteria. This belief also kept women's sexuality under the control of men and resulted in the widespread practice of female genital mutilation and other forms of sexual violence against women. The historical impact of these beliefs continues to be felt today, as women continue to fight for equality and emancipation from a patriarchal society. And there you have it, 5 crazy things people in the Middle Ages believed. Though these beliefs may seem absurd to us now, they were held by many people during that time. The Middle Ages was a time of great change, where perspectives on religion, science, and society were being redefined. The beliefs of people back then reflect the way they thought and viewed the world. It's important to remember that many of our current beliefs may be viewed as equally absurd by future generations. Thanks for watching Brainwaves. We hope you learned a lot.